Everybody, welcome. A lot of time has gone by since we welcomed everyone to an artist talk with lots of events and adventures filling in the spaces. But here we are. So thank you everyone for sharing this evening. Just by being here, you're supporting our artists and our new gallery. And especially thank you for participating in tonight's artist talk with master printer and artist Lisa Mackie. Lisa Mackie has really shown a light for all of us into the world of prints and printmaking. Mitchell Giddings was introduced to her collaborative prints in the work of Emily Mason, with whom Lisa worked for over 25 years. We were immediately struck by the richness and wide variety of surfaces and textures, often showing a complexity of visual information at least equal to Mason's oil paintings. In the art of the chop, this variety is magnified as each artist expresses in their own voice a vision realized through their collaboration with Lisa as she manages, engages, and guides them through their project, engendering images unique to the process. Catherine Brown, founder of Crown Point Press in San Francisco, suggests that in addition to technical knowledge, a printer must have a good rapport with the artist. She says, printers have to be able to guide the artist without imposing themselves too much. I can't stress this point enough. It's a collaborative effort, but it is the artist's work. And for their collaborative artistry, printmaker Lisa Mackie and the chosen artists share the privilege of signing the completed print. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Lisa Mackie.
Oh, thank you. Well, Jim asked me to talk a little bit about how I got into printmaking and how I ended up making prints with different people. But I first want to thank Jim and Petey so much for giving me the chance to have this wonderful show here and to have all these prints be together. And it's been really wonderful. And how I ended up here, I think, was really due to Emily Mason and Wolfe. So I had been working with them for so long, and I know Emily said and Wolfe said, gee, you got to come up to Brattleboro and see this wonderful gallery. And I was so impressed, and it's just wonderful to be here and to be able to have the opportunity to show work. So that really is how I ended up here. And how I ended up with Wolfe and Emily, I think, was because I was very involved in making prints when I came to New York, and going back even further, all the way back to printmaking in undergraduate school. So I've actually done printmaking since I was a sophomore in college and gotten into it. And my mom, who has a print also in the other room, really loved printmaking. She was a painter and graduated from Cranbrook Art Academy with a BFA and an MFA, and ended up teaching in a wonderful school that I went to for gifted kids. And she was very original and took her painting and took it into teaching, and the kids all just absolutely loved how she motivated them into not conventional ways, very unconventional ways. And since then, I've been kind of fascinated with both painting and printmaking. So that's kind of where I started, and then University of Michigan and University of Wisconsin ended up doing a lot in printmaking. When I got out of college, I didn't get a teaching job like everybody wanted to get a teaching job, but I did find a wonderful print studio in Boston, Massachusetts. So it was called Impressions Workshop, and I was very enamored mostly with lithography. And they were looking for a printer in lithography, so I got a professional training then. And so just to go back to that point, I think that's how I learned to work professionally in printmaking and learned about collaboration. After that, I actually worked on my own prints while I was learning to do that, and I ended up having a show there. My first one-person show was at Impressions in 1975, so that was a long time ago. And it was in printmaking and also did painting. And from there, I ended up being in Boston, and my work got collected by a lot of collectors, which was really exciting. And then I started teaching and making prints and collaborating at the workshop. So From there on, I ended up being in New York eventually in 1980 and ended up printing at Blackburn's, of course, and getting working with Kathy Carraccio's studio. And one day I woke up after working with Kathy for about 8 years. I said, I'm going to get a press in my studio in the city. And I did. So I got a 3660 brand press. And at that time, I'd actually collaborated with Emily and Wolfe at Kathy's, but they were my clients, so I was working at the workshop with them, and that was really exciting. And so from then, I got some other print jobs, and then ended up doing that. I never really was only working as a printmaker, printing for other people. I also got into June Kelly Gallery, I think around in '87. And so from there, I was having one-person shows and working on my own work. So I was able to do all of that. And also, I think when I first got to New York, I was at NYU, I taught, and then eventually taught at other places too. So now I teach at Queens College, and I also teach at York College, both CUNY schools. So I teach printmaking, of course, and just adjunct. And so I'm able to do all sorts of different things as opportunities come along. So anyway, that's briefly biography. And so I don't know if you guys would like to have me talk about just a range of the prints, or you would have some questions. Would anybody have any questions specifically about prints? I think Jim and Petey were enjoying all the stories we had about prints. So also any technical information, and also how one does collaborate with artists, I think is also an interesting topic. Does anybody have any questions, like place to start, or even Jim? Or
I'd be interested in hearing a little bit about your work.
Oh, okay. Well, you know what I would like to do is I would like to talk about my work at the end, when we made a plan that after we talk about all these pieces, since we're in this room and we can get easily here with the video, that we could get up and then all go into the other room to stand a little bit, and I can talk about my work and how it applies to the other work. So I have been successful at managing the idea of doing my own work and showing it and working with other people, which I know is always a dilemma for everybody. How are we going to manage all these things? But I think mainly because making prints with people is very exciting. And so for me, it's part of what I do. It's just become like another arm, you know what I mean? So it's been something that is enriching to me, and at the same time, I've kind of printed my way through my life, I've always said. So I'm here now with all these wonderful prints, and it's actually very satisfying and exciting that I know these people and have worked with them. You had a question?
I'm just curious about, the new, the digital revolution that we're in, and do you end up having to teach that integrated with your printmaking processes?
Sure. I mean, I think the digital process, or, photo process, I think we could talk about that as photo process, like the idea of solar plates and all sorts of different types of photo process transferring into handmade process is very, very interesting. Yeah. And you can get a precision that you could get that you wouldn't be able to get in another type of process, and also exposing photo plates and things like that. So, yeah.
Keeping a limited edition.
And
keeping a limited edition.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a whole nother market, the digital, actually things printed off of computer, but using that and integrating that with a handmade process is very interesting. So. Yes.
Are there some specific pieces, or several of them, that you remember clearly some of the process that you went through, what your discussion was with the artists in terms of how you guided them and what you talked about, what they thought about? I mean, you might not remember that about too many, but if there are any.
I remember almost everything.
Okay,
That's interesting. I think because it's kind of like a conversation, and it's not so easy to just kind of like, oh, this happened, oh, this happened. So, you know, you really do have to kind of have it all kind of work toward. So, I mean, we were standing by the Hartigan, so we could talk about those if you wanted to, just in terms of process. First of all, Grace Hartigan, this was printed at Printmaking Workshop. So Bob Blackburn, who ran Printmaking Workshop for many, many years, and of course is just a legend in his own time, and now continues on through the Elizabeth Foundation. So Printmaking Workshop is still continuing on, and I had a wonderful opportunity to work with Bob. And Bob, you know, as soon as you moved to New York City, Bob was on the phone, wanted to come and look at my portfolio. He just was a hot wire in printmaking in New York City. Like, you'd go to openings and he'd be there writing down notes and, you know, asking people. And he would always have jobs. So he would call me oftentimes for jobs that might require more skill in different print media. He was a real pro in lithography, actually, was his métier. He knew etching very well as well, but he was Titania Grossman's first at ULAE printer, one of their first printers, and he was also black, which was, you know, out in Long Island, was, you know, very ambitious. And then he started Printmaking Workshop. And Grace Hartigan, of course, is, you know, a tradition along with Pollock and Guston and all the abstract expressionists. And he called me and he said, I have some stones that Grace Hartigan has made already, but we let them sit for a while. Now we have a project, we have some funds, and could you come and work on the stones? So these were directly worked onto litho stones, nice big stones, like, you know, so that was exciting. And I think they had been rolled up by somebody, probably by Bob. And then he said, well, now I want you to roll them up and we need to print them, and we're going to call Grace Hartigan in, and she's going to be with us to work with the stones. And so I proofed them up and she looked at them, and I said, well, so what are we going to do? Should we just have them be like this? And she said, well, I want to have them look like they're made in a cave, that like a stone that was in a cave, and I made it. And you could see her hands moving everything around and spattering, and, you know, really very gutsy. And these were called the Princesses of Power. So she was just really a wonderful person, very exciting to meet and talk with. And she had all sorts of stories about Guston. And as I'm rolling things up and printing the litho stones, sponging, she's telling me all about all these wonderful, like, characters and the bar and who Guston was and how they all got along. It was just great. And so, but she said, you know, what are we going to do? And I said, well, she said, one thing I want is I want the shape of the stone. So I want you to make sure you print that. Well, normally in litho, you don't print the shape of the stone because it'll break the stone. So what we did was we rolled the stone, and then after we printed it, we brayered the edges of the stone. So I didn't have to print directly on the outside. And that created this interesting shape of the stones. And see here, this is a purple stone, so it's a different shape. And so there also was a question, well, is this just going to be a black and white print? I mean, it's going to be great, but maybe we could work with the idea of the colors, like the primary colors. I said, what about chincolet? Because I knew a lot about chincolet, and I thought, well, this would be a great way to have some kind of crazy paper behind, or tint paper or whatever. She said, I don't want paper. I want it to be one thing. I don't want to have chincolet. I said, oh, okay. And she said, but I like the idea of a texture behind. How are we going to create that texture? So I thought, well, I couldn't see her making a texture. It was kind of like the print itself was really done. You know what I mean? I mean, her vitality in these prints were complete, you know, that activity. So I said, well, what about we use different types of paper, but we don't actually use the paper itself. So we kind of, like, together dreamed up this texture idea where we would get rice paper, and I made a plate that had the area out here that was, you know, gummed out, and we could roll it like a flat, and then I would run the flat through with a piece of Asian paper, but with very light pressure. So the flat would actually just pull off the texture of the paper. And I could mark the litho press. Normally you don't have marks on the press, but I could mark the press and make it a light pressure. Then I printed it with a full pressure, and the pressure then made the imprint of the print that was left on the plate. I don't know if you get what I'm saying, but anyway. And then we had full pressure, so then I could register the stone to that edge. And actually it was a really cool technique. And eventually I was working with Amy Ernst, and she was doing a lot with texture and decoupage type things. And I said, you know what? I want to share with you this texture that I shared with Grace Hartigan. And it turned out this one doesn't necessarily show that texture, but it was a great technique for her. And of course, she used it in a very different way, so that was really exciting. And I don't think I ever would have thought of that had I not had the need to collaborate with Grace. And I always felt like basically going to openings was really not my thing. But a wonderful way to meet people and get to know people was like a first-hand way to know people on this artistic basis where I could meet Wolfe and Emily and all these wonderful artists and just really get to know them in a very special way. So kind of playing inside their mind and them playing inside my mind. So that's always been really good. Jim.
You partially answered my question. I was going to ask if I were an artist that didn't know you and you didn't know me, and I came up to you and said, here's what we want. And you've explained some of the beautiful interaction with Grace Hartigan. So I'm curious about Saul LeWitt, who works conceptually, figures things out mathematically. How much involvement in the printing of his images did you have, or did he have, I should say?
Well, okay, so the truth is I never met Saul LeWitt. I never actually encountered Saul LeWitt. But he did sign all the prints that I submitted. So essentially the story was that Joe Watanabe's studio is out in Brooklyn. And it's a fantastic studio. Joe Watanabe has since retired, but his studio still goes on. He printed for LeWitt, he's printed for Robert Mangold. He did a lot of the pochoir things that you saw on the walls and Pace editions, where they were pochoir. Most of those things were done by the printers that Watanabe Studio had. And Kathy and I, when we were working, I think I was in my own, I already had my own press in '91, and I remember I talked to Kathy and I said, I don't have too much work right now. I'd be good at summer, we're not teaching. Do you know of any jobs? And she said, well, I don't know. But I got invited to go to lunch at Watanabe's studio, and would you like to come with me? And so I said, sure. And Watanabe, at his studio, he had a lot of Japanese people came here to work at Watanabe Studio, and they would make this fantastic Asian lunch every lunchtime. It was like a family. And so we went to lunch, and after we had this wonderful lunch and met all the people and also saw how they pochoired everything, and he's mostly silkscreen. He did have a small crew of etching people. He walked us into this room, and there were like, I don't know, there's 12 of those, I think, series of the derived forms on the wall up there above the press, and he said, could you guys help me print this? And I said, well, sure, Kathy, I'm going, yeah, this is cool, we have a job. And so Kathy got 5, I think, to print, and I got 4. So what happened was, the prints were already proofed, and so the game was we had to take our studios. They had a Martech press, so they brought the inks, they brought everything, the plates, everything, and each of us printed. And the reason why was because there's a deadline to do it. I think it was a Christmas kind of deadline, a December deadline, and they had to get it done. And so that was very, very interesting because they were very hard to print because of the register, and it's a 4-color etchings, each one. So they had to be all inked at once, then they had to be run through, and no goofing up, because if anything was off, any register, any mar, anything, they were out. And so there was edition 30, but it was a big challenge to do the prints. And then Watanabe printer would come, and they were not actually, they were stapled, but they were not trimmed. So we gave them to them with the stapled stretched, they would take them and then they would call you up and say how many more they needed of the prints, how many were accepted and how many weren't. And so that it was a big challenge. Both Kathy and I would call on the phone and say, how did you do this and how did you do that? We've always been very good with sharing information. We never kept any secrets from each other. And so we got them done, and it was really, I feel very proud to have them and to have accomplished that. So I think I did have to hire an assistant at a certain point because cleaning the edges, everything was just really, really hard. The other thing that's interesting, though, just to keep it going, is that Watanabe didn't even see LeWitt except for the signing. All of this was done by faxing 4 or 5 images that were very small, that were drawn shapes. So each shape is a suite, and each shape was drawn so that it fit together like a puzzle. So Watanabe, his printers took it and blew it up to size and then had to photo make the plates because they had to be precisely in register, because in etching you print wet. So each thing had to register in, and you had to figure out how to work it so that the stretch would accommodate for that. LeWitt knew he was giving everybody a nightmare. But that's what LeWitt loved doing. He was just having a great time, you know, don't worry. And he is very giving. I mean, he was a very good person. He wasn't persnickety, but he, of course, demanded perfection. So it was just kind of like the opposite, well, not the opposite of Hartigan, but, you know, another edge of how can you print this 4-color etching. So not only were the drawings made such that there was red, yellow, blue, and gray. So that's what you see in this print here, red, yellow, blue, and gray. Each one is an aqua-tinted surface, but they were either fine aquatint or coarse aquatint. So that also, if you look at them, you'll see that some of the aquatints are just like sheer. Others are kind of grainy a little bit. So the red, yellow, blue, and gray had to be mixed exactly. So when we got the prints, we were not using the same press, and obviously it was a whole different thing. So our press put down different presses. Kathy also has a Charles Brand press. So both of us, we were also using their inks that they mixed. They were using not tarlatan, but a tool, like a different material. So everything had to be matched exactly. And it was just like the hyper test, you know what I mean? So it was very exciting, and I feel great that I actually came through alive with 4 of them. So Kathy did 5, and I think there's, 4 and 5, and then there was 12, so they had to do 3 or 4. And it makes a beautiful wall, the derived forms. Anyway, that's the story on the LeWitts. You know, there are some photo-based images as well, like the over here, the Briggs prints. Maura Briggs he's a very far-ranging artist. Can I go around this way? And just to bring that up a different way. And what he did, he knew he wanted to do something with images, and he loved the idea of using collages of famous paintings and also drawing at the same time. So he made a plate, and it's actually 2 plates. You see where this is in half, 2 very long plates. And it was a black and white collage, which we then photographed and made photo etchings of. So if you do that, you photograph the black and white, and then you make a transparency, a positive, and then you can expose it, okay? And then this was virtually 2 key images, and he also drew on top of it. So he used the different paintings, and then he drew on top of it, all making it in black and white. And once I had the 2 plates, he said to me, now this is a whole nother way of getting at it, which is interesting, the different processes that artists give you, the different parameters that they give you, you know, to collaborate. So I had all these collage papers, and he said to me, well, just think antique. okay? Just take all those collage papers and color and just mix them up and print them, okay? So I said, oh, okay. And so I did that, you know, and usually like with different artists, you have different basis on which you actually, you know, it's either hourly or it's by the print. And so in this case, it was just an hourly rate. So he said, spend a couple of days and do it. So I sent it to him. And, you know, they had all these different collage elements and all different colors, and when you look at them, and it was called the Adam and Eve series. And when he got them, he calls me up and he says, I don't like them at all. I said, oh, okay, well, you said antique. I mean, I don't know what antique is. You know, I just winged it, you know. He says, okay, think bright. Let's try that. So I says, don't worry, I'll give you 2 more days on it. So I did that, and I had a good time printing and, you know, rubbing the ink and all that. And then he calls me up and he says, you know, I love them. He said, I started working on top of them, and they're so exciting. Now I love them, and I love the new ones you sent me because I love making my work on top of them. So these are some of the prints I think that I would say I had the most freedom on. And then he got also very free himself. And if you look at it, there's lots of areas that are painted and scratched out and drawn on top of. And so that was kind of like the whole other, you know, gamut of how you can get these prints to go. And actually, he was totally pleased because he sold them all. So I said, I want one. I said, I worked really hard on those. And he said, yeah, all right, I give you one. So, and this was another one that was like that. So he did a collage, and then we made the photo plates, and so you could see the dot patterns and everything. And then this was much more straightforward. We just kind of printed it in black and white, and then he worked on top of it. So, you know, there's no rules really, you know, to how you do it, you know.
Are these one of a kind then?
They were one of a kind, yeah. So, and that long format was really, really interesting. But you could see where it's put together right there. And so, yeah. And, you know, it's like all, if you look at it, like the red is painted, this is oil pastel. He just, you know, had a good time with it. They've lasted, you know, a long time. The Chincolet is really good. Another really interesting one is Margot Humphrey. And that is combined. She wanted to work with the Haitian boat people, and that at the time that we did this, I'm not sure of the date, that was in the paper. The boat, you know, was out in sea, and the people were in the boat, and so she really wanted to talk about it. And so she used a newspaper photographs, which she saw, and this is a dry point. So the key plate, you would call it, would be the big black and white dry point. And so she put that underneath and moved around all the papers, the newspaper photos, and kind of drew from them and made the people in the boat. And you can see she also put in a god. So it says, only with the gods, I think is the title, or with the gods watching. And so that was the idea, that the gods were watching the people in the boat in the storm. And then she wanted some kind of blend behind. So I used a silk collagraph, which is another technique, and made a blend into that plate. So she painted this by taking a piece of silk and laminated it to a piece of styrene, actually. And then you can clog it by using acrylic paint. So that's what you see behind there. So it was kind of technically tricky because I had to print that, let that dry, and she was very enamored with all of the different kinds of paper. And so she used a lot of the paper, and that was then Chincolet, and then the dry point printed on top. So again, I didn't have much to do with the conceptualizing of this, but then I was more instrumental in getting the technique, that blended idea with the line and all that. So this was Vijay Kumar actually helped me with this one for printing, because I had so many pieces that had to be cut, and then they had to be glued onto this before the dry point was printed. So it was like an hour to print each one, you know, with the gluing and all that. So she did a whole series. That was through Bob Blackburn also, through, I believe, a Ford Foundation grant. So we did another couple of small pieces as well. So that was the big one, and that was about edition 25 or so. So.
How much variation would there be between the 25?
Oh, pretty close. I mean, it was all about the same. So the trick was getting all the papers and making sure we had all the sizes of the papers and cut those, and then, you know, making sure everything was ready to print it, you know. So there wasn't too much variation on that one. Yeah, oh, Petey, yeah? Go ahead.
Since you're standing in front of Emily's piece, can you
Sure.
talk about how you created that more?
Sure.
Emily?
Sure, that's a beauty. Well, Emily, of course, you know, so wonderful to work with, both Wolfe and Emily. But Emily works very spontaneously, but she liked working into matrices. So she worked with Janice Stemmerman with the Carborundum tint, which is one technique, and then she used actually the same thing, the silk holograph technique, to make the plates. And so she would work with the holograph. They weren't clogged too much, but the advantage of the silk holograph is that it holds a lot of ink. And so you can get second pulls out of it because the ink will be residual. You can keep inking it and you'll get even more prints. So you get this wonderful, rich, rich color, which I think Emily just loved. And, you know, we loved it from Emily, that ability to work with that saturated color. She wanted to do some edition prints. So all of those that you see out there, I'm pretty sure are not editions. They're unique pieces. So from one thing to another, printing over and over again. But this piece is an edition print, probably 30 or 60, I can't quite remember. And I probably did 2 or 3 edition prints with her. So the way we did that, to keep it spontaneous, and I did that with the Hutto and with Michael Steiner as well, I always felt like making a print was kind of a static kind of problem. Like people would come in and they would have a picture, like a watercolor, and they say, I want to make a print of this. You know, I've got a publisher, I have a market for this, that's what I want to make a print of that. I always felt like that was a little forced, you know, because you were looking at a watercolor or an oil painting and we were trying to make a print out of it. It wasn't really integrated with the process. So Kathy and I both did, with the Hutto and with the Steiner, we had a job where we had a chance to do editions for a publisher, but we both had 2 people that were very abstract oriented. So what we did was and this I did with Emily as well, you have to kind of set up a process, and it has to be a process you kind of can market, you know, because it can't work forever on a print, because you have to bill somebody's paying you for that. So with Michael and Daryl, what we did was we took maybe a week or 5 days of monotyping, and we worked with a matrix that they had created, or more than one matrix that they had created. So they would come in, spend a day or 2 either making an etched matrix, and in this case it was a soft ground with kind of like a comb, and then drawing that lifted off, and we could etch that. And with Emily, in her case, it was a silk holograph plate, which she already had made. And then we would make prints off of that plate, okay? So we would have all these uniques, all right? So once we had the uniques, and they could be chincolets or whatever, they could be any kind of, you know, this was a unique too originally. We would then take the uniques, and the artists and we and the publisher too, if they were involved in that way, would look at everything and decide what would be a good editionable print. And since it was in a matrix, I could usually go back to the process and actually recreate that in a stencil or by some means, you see. So that way I could create an edition that literally came from a unique from the matrix. And that was really exciting. And that's how this piece came about. So what that means too is that, like this line, for example, is a fresh line. And this, in addition, is not made by Emily, it's made by me. Mm-hmm. But the way it's made is because I have a stencil there so that I can make the line exactly as she described the line. And then with her approval, usually I would bring it to the artist, like 15 of them, let's say, and the artist could say, in that case with Steiner and Darrell, they could say, well, I don't like the way that line looks. Could you make it a little this way or that way? So you would actually go right back into what the artist, how they responded. And that would work very, very well, because usually it was something you could correct or change or whatever. And usually once it was on the plate, you could just kind of redo that line yet again. So you would see it. And so that's how we created that print.
So how many times would that have been through the press?
Oh, well, that's a good question. So 4 or 5 times through the press is hard, okay, for a register. But this has gone through the press once. So the red is a chincolet piece, and that can be put on a template. And I can actually use the decal, and create that decal specifically in that way. So maybe not every single decal is exactly, but it will give you the same feeling. So, when you work with an artist like that, some artists could work that way and some couldn't. But most artists that work in a more free way generally respond in a kind of, they like it, that things would vary, but they would be the same. I know with Steiner, there was one line, like this yellow line, and he loved it, but he had some corrections for me. So I fixed the stencil, and we got it so that he responded well to it. So yeah, this is a good question, though. Thank you, Petey.
Can you talk about?
Hmm?
Go ahead. Can you talk about working with Wolfe Kahn?
Of course, yes. We can even go over there. Let's see. Well, what's nice about the Wolfe Kahns? Wolfe is amazing. Still amazing and amazing. Such a fantastic person to work with. All these artists are fantastic. Wolfe loved doing the monotypes, and so we did the monotypes into a steel plate, which is a plate that's kind of created an aquatint, a kind of bumpy aquatint, like sandpaper, essentially. And he specifically liked the sandpaper kind of textures that was on the steel to be kind of coarse. And the reason why was because when he did his crayoning onto the steel, it would look very much like the scumbling that he did in his paintings. And so that really worked. And so we did a lot of monotypes. And the thing he liked about the monotype is the ghost would stay on the plate, so he could keep adding to it, all right? And he would then add to it or change the sky, make it blue instead of green or this or that. And he could change the colors around, but he still kind of had the same matrix. But that didn't work for making prints. That was kind of tricky. So actually this piece did come from a monotype. This one derived from a pastel. So usually there was a derivation for the print. But the thing about Wolfe was he did many prints, not just with me, but he has done many prints if you look. But what he didn't like about making prints, which is what I kind of had to look at, because you find what they like and what they don't like, and it always makes me jump into somebody else's mind, and then it opens my mind even further. So I always just kind of love doing that. What he didn't like was to be able to have a layer and then a layer and then a layer. He doesn't like to work that way. He's a painter, he wants to have it all be one on top of the other. So thinking about that and knowing about the carborundum aquatint, which Janice has done, but we did a lot of that. That's very simple. I thought, well, let's do this. Let's start with a basic thing like a dry point, okay? But we already had the structure of the image in the pastel. So like, I think this is a good example, the Hampton Barn. There's the dry point is here printed in a kind of brownish color. You can see it here. If you look later, you could look closely and see that line. So that was my key. Then what I did was I wanted to work with something very simple, very direct, so it wasn't so technical, that he could work with, that was going to come out like he did it. I had plexiglass plates cut exactly the size of the metal plate that he did the dry point on. And then I could put the one plexiglass plate right on top of the dry point, and he could figure out the color. He was very good at looking at color and just deciding what color could be where. And he would like put, for example, the yellow down here in the carborundum. So he knew that that would eventually be inked in yellow. Carborundum's kind of gray with an acrylic base. And so then he could add a couple of the colors that were far enough away from this on that same plate. And I found that you could only do maybe 3 plexiglass plates and 1 dry point plate. If you kept running things through the press any more than that, the paper would start creasing. You couldn't really get it to work. So then once that was dry, we could put another plate on top of that plate, and then he could decide what color would be the next color, and then the next color, and then the next colors. And so then I would start mixing the colors, kind of matching what he had. And in this case, there was a monotype, so I could kind of match those colors. Then it was bring it to his studio, have him look at it, not like it, and then bring it back, and then change it, and then bring it back and forth. So there was this back and forth thing with the preciseness of the color. The color was really paramount with everything. Transparency, color, more yellow, more red, whatever. And I found that to mix, usually when you make prints, you make the colors, and then you match the colors to print it. I couldn't do that with him. I would just make the colors, and then I would add to those colors. So I would never have to remake that color, because he was very, very picky about the color. It was very, very important. And we could modify, we could scrape off some of the carborundum if he didn't want it. And then usually we had to steel face the copper plates, because copper oxidizes, and so color was, again, going to get altered by that. So we steel face the plate so we could have precise color. So that's kind of what we did with the edition prints. And you know, he liked doing the prints. That was fun for him and exciting. This one was a commission for the Metropolitan Museum Gallery. And this was a commission for, well, this turned into its own little edition, but this was supposed to be for poetry from Robert Bly. And the other 2, he just did. But this is a piece, you've seen this composition before for Wolfe, so he kind of worked with that. And he liked the color overlapping, so if you look, you can see a lot of the color overlaying each other, very active, live color. Oh. What do you think? You guys okay? Following all this? Yeah, any other comments or?
Should talk about Maryland's and.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, Marilyn's prints, Marilyn Denton and she was on the card. I think they're beautiful pieces. We wanted to do some additions. She's also a monotype artist, so a lot of the artists that I have worked with in monotype. So, you know, we already had a rapport in that kind of technique. And so she had done many, many monotypes. And the way she did monotypes, everybody seems to approach them different. That's oil-based. We would roll colors. We would roll a flat, usually on one piece of plexiglass, and then we would roll another flat. And then she would take that one, well, this is kind of the basic way she would work. And then she would use solvent, which is real smelly, but we would do that, with large brushes, and she would make these marks onto her monotype. And then the cool thing would be she would take a roller and she would roll over that. And when she would roll over it, it would change the lines that she made that have cut into the solvent. So it would make these kind of altered kind of shapes. And when we printed that on top of another flat, we would get this wonderful glowing effect. So then how are we going to make an addition out of that? Because you can't make addition out of all this solvent and all this stuff. So what we did was we used the solar plate technique. The solar plate technique is a photo-based technique where it's light onto a photopolymer material, which is onto a surface of steel. I'm trying to like get it clear. So that's what that is, but we have to expose it with a light. And so how are we going to have a transparency? Are we going to actually take an image and then blow it up photographically? That seemed kind of boring because that didn't seem quite like what we wanted to do. So what we did was we took we took an acetate and rolled it with a black ink, and then we cut it with solvent. And then we rolled it, and we did quite a few of those, and we let them dry. So we had a transparency, all right? So that's what we could use, and it was life size. It was the exact size of the plates. And this was about as big as we could go, because 32 by 42 is the biggest size of the plates. And as a result, we had to go out to Hampton Editions with Dan Weldon, and we had to use his solar plate machine to expose it with a light. So solar plate is something that works very easily if you have the right machinery. But if you don't have the right machinery with a bigger light, you get all this light bouncing off and you can't really get it. So we did do that, so we made the plates out there. And so there was a series of 5 plates and in a portfolio, it was a beautiful portfolio called Perfect Pitch, and we printed 25 in black of each one in a beautiful portfolio, and then in color we printed 5 of them in different colors. So these are 2 of those images. They're printed on a very heavy Somerset Radiant White, which is a really beautiful paper. It's very, very heavy, has kind of a mass to it. They're kind of like objects almost. So, and the one on the left is got a red, a yellow background and a green also. So that's 3. Most of them were 2 colors with the background. So, was that good, John? Was it good? It was a project. People have asked me, did I actually print things? Yes, I did actually ink. I do, more or less, I've inked everything. So I've been the one inking.
Talk about Leo Manzo.
Sure, you want, are we good? Yeah? Oh, yeah, okay. All right, so I'm going slowly here so you can. Huh? Yeah, the Leo Manzo, okay. Yeah. Oh, well, Leo has it's a fun story. Leo Manzo was an artist who shared a studio for years with Bob Blackburn. So he didn't share the studio per se, he rented his own studio, but they were there. And when I first moved to New York City, Bob Blackburn wanted to find a job for me at a printmaking workshop. That's kind of how when he would see somebody who could print and whatever, he wanted to get you. And so he said, I've got a job for you to work with Leo Manzo. And so I did actually do that job, and we did make a beautiful print called Dark Angel, which is not this print. And he did get, he got a Guggenheim and a Prix de Rome, I think, off of those prints that we did, which was very good. And then by then I was working at Kathy's Caraccio studio, so I said, I would like Leo to work with me at Kathy Caraccio's, which really did upset Bob Blackburn a bit, but I wanted to have him where I was, in the studio that I was. So we did get him to come, and this gave him a chance to do a suite of prints, and the suite, he had kind of had a vision that it would be called variazione, like to work on something and then to change it over and over again. He loved going to Italy, and so Italy was very much a part of him. And so we started on some things. Well, Leo taught at Art Students League for years. He was a member of the Provincetown 10 or whatever it is with Pollock and Frankenthaler. And so he was really, and Motherwell, he knew Motherwell very well. So he was really a very charismatic, wonderful person to be with. And Kathy's studio was up these steps, so he would come up the steps, and we would work for several times since he had this, the funds to work with. And it was very exciting, but I wasn't really getting very far with it. It just, I don't know, it just wasn't happening. And so one day he walked up the steps, and he had this old piece of brown paper which had been run over in the street many, many times, and it was a shape. And he said, I want to print this. And so I said, okay. And Kathy was there too, sort of as was a nice guide, because we always worked together. So I said, let's run it through the press with a soft ground, and we'll create this piece of paper onto a big piece of steel. And at that time we were working on steel because it was much cheaper, and it held a tone very nicely. It etched very well. And so we ran it through, and we ended up with this wonderful shape of the bag. And then he said, well, just print them. And we rolled them different colors, and we loved the silver ink. And so we printed them, and then he took them, we got him to his studio. And then I came to his studio, and he had all these funny things on them. Like here he had this red string that was just kind of, he had dipped it in ink, and he had put it right on top of that one. And he had like a piece of paper which was torn, and an envelope which was opened up, and it had this blue lining, and that was the kind of the shape of the envelope opened up. And so he said, I want to do that. That's what I want to do. And so I had to figure out how could I do that with this wonderful texture that I had here. So I had a lot of problems doing that, because that was another piece of steel, which was then taking the very string and then airbrushing around it so that I could etch that string so it would really look like a piece of string. And we had this piece of paper, like Jim, when he looked at it, he said, oh, it looks like a torn piece of paper, but it isn't. It's an aqua tint, which has 2 levels, so I could ink it one level and then ink it another, so that the edge of the paper would show the black. And then this was a piece of plastic which we scored and then printed that beautiful blue, because, you know, not trying to paint it or find it was much more difficult than printing it. So it was very carefully traced and cut. And this was a stamp that he made. And then this was an interesting one. He actually collaged that on. So that's collaged on. And what that was evidently, I don't know if this happens now in Italy, but there was a small envelope that if somebody passed away, it would have a X on it, a black X and a border on it. And then the person would write the note about that person's death, and then the notes would be slipped underneath the doors of the people that they wanted to notify about the death. And so that, you know, we wouldn't really know that so much, although now that you know it, you can only kind of see that. And that was on paper that he would go to like antique shops, and he would find all these paper that had original script on it and collect it. And so he would cut it out. So he always, at one point I think I went to his house, and I actually did meet Motherwell, who was sitting on the couch, because he knew Motherwell, but he, I think, did kind of always be under the shadow of Motherwell in a sense. But I always felt like Leo had a very different sensibility to his work from Motherwell. And, you know, if you look carefully at his work, you'll see that his work is very, very individual. It's very special, very, and again, such a wonderful person. And I was really so happy that I met Leo through Bob Blackburn and was able to really work with him. The other 2 pieces, I have 2 other pieces from the Variazioni series. They all have the paper, the brown paper, more or less in the same spot, but the one of them has, he came and he had 2 pieces of black paper over them, like standing. And so the trick was, do you do an aqua tint for that? I mean, it's going to be difficult to do that. So I just took pieces of acetate and I rolled them black, but I cut them exactly like the paper with every decal and whatever, you know, variation. And then I could print this, and then I could just lay those on top and run it through the press. It was very simple. That was one. And then the other one had like an envelope, a light blue envelope, but it also had a string. And that was tricky because the string was a special way. And I thought, well, I don't know if we want to ink the string. So what I did was I took the string and I traced how it would go. Then I got the string, and then I hardened it up with acrylic, and then I put it with acetate, and then I put it on top of that trace, and then I could run it through, and I embossed the string down there. So the idea was each thing had a different type of solution, which I thought was really cool. So yeah, and the paper seemed to be very important to that too. Yes.
Anna's got a question.
Oh, yes.
You speak with such extraordinary specificity about each of these really diverse processes that I'm wondering, do you have a recipe book? Do you keep, I mean, because did you keep logs of, I mean, as you were,
You know, it's really
or
funny.
maybe your mind is just like, this is what you do.
I don't know.
obviously.
It's very funny because at school, you know, I teach like litho, I teach etching, I teach all these different processes, and the students are like, well, I do have some instruction sheets, but it's like you have to make your own notes about it, and they're always kind of amazed that I'll know the formulas, and there's a couple of formulas, you know, I have to write down or whatever, but mostly I remember all of the things very clearly. I think it's just part of the steps, you know, of solving the problem, you know. And I do feel like it is really interesting to be in somebody else's mindset. You know, like oftentimes I'll be doing something, I mean, with monotype it's very, you know, it's a kind of more free, really, you know. They're doing things and they're grabbing colors and you're solving problems kind of on the go. You know, where here you have to kind of get it to how can you make this work, how can you print it again, or whatever. But it's interesting because I think it's always questioning, well, are those, you know, that was something I would never think of, you know, and then thinking, well, I mean, that color could not be right, and then it turns out to be right. So you learn that everybody solves it in a different way, and it's so, like, I don't know, giving for me to be always getting to solve these problems that I had never expected I needed to solve, you know what I mean? And then they add to kind of my repertoire of what I do. So, I mean, it's also one thing, too, it's like a language, you know, like you have this and then you learn you could do that, and then you learn, well, what's the simplest way I could do that, you know, like without going the regular route, is there another way, you know? So, Jim, you had a question?
Well, I don't know how many more questions are coming from the audience, but maybe we could continue the discussion in the room where your own work is.
Yeah.
I don't know if...
Yeah. Do we have any last questions, maybe? Anything that people, and I'm right here too afterwards to answer.
This is sort of a transitional question
Okay,
anyway.
transitional. Go
My
ahead.
question was, do you have that same memory bank for your own work as you do for other people's work?
Well, there is something that I do with my own work, which is kind of interesting. If you go on the website, because we didn't really explore that so much here, but I tend to like to have a process of like a story or an original book, that where there's a story and somehow it's modified or changed, and then the images kind of come out of that story. The story may be more visual than it is verbal. So the horseshoe crab one is got a story to it, and so I like kind of combining words and images, but sometimes the words may not be there. They might be in a video, or they might not even be there. So that kind of thing, yeah. So I don't know if that's really the same as something like this, but I do tend to like to vary my work from one thing to another. So it's kind of a continuum, you know, if that answers it. I don't know. Yeah, do you guys want to get up and come? And then that way we can kind of, because then you won't have to come sit down again. Unless you want to, you can come.
I know, it's kind of sick.
Essentially, we sort of had this be like kind of like the family room in a sense. So these are my pieces. So this piece, Strawberry Moon, this piece and this piece. This is my mom's print. So she would come and do monoprints with me, like usually as a kind of present. We would, I would give her a present, like a couple days monotyping, and she loved doing that. She also could work at her table and do a lot of the water-based. So oftentimes I would have her do a project, like I was very experimenting a lot with the water-based techniques. So this was 2 plates, I believe, and also chincolet. And so she could do that at home and then bring them in. So I'd oftentimes use her kind of as experimenting. And she did paintings all the way till she was very old, so it would be very fun. So this is a piece by my brother, and my brother really has done many, many paintings and many, many things. He's not working as much right now. He's a little bit younger than me, but we had an opportunity to show some work, and so he did a hard ground, and this is called yellow crash. He likes to use like materials where they're kind of floating and exploding, and machines and things, and then just simply with a roll over that. So that's my brother. And then where Petey and Jim are, that's my sister-in-law. So that's Elba Damast, who passed away a while ago. But this was a litho where she's a Venezuelan artist and was in the city for many, many years and wanted to do a litho. I believe it's probably edition 60 or 80, and it's many, many colors. So we added a lot of colors, and the flat is also, that creamy color is printed on the paper. And so I thought that would be interesting to show that as well. And then the other pieces are mine. And again, I like to work kind of with a theme. And so these are some of the newer pieces. I show at June Kelly Gallery in New York, in the city, and I'm very lucky to have been there, represented by June since '87, as I said. And usually she's got a fairly large roster, so maybe every 4 years, which gives me a really good chance to make a whole oeuvre of paintings and really develop it. And this was from the show Here, Then, and Now. And the theme was working with the idea of the horseshoe crab. So you may not all know about what the horseshoe crab is, but it's a very old, ancient, I guess, animal that now exists very deep into the salt water. And it was a prehistoric animal, actually was alive when the dinosaur was alive and lived through the Ice Age. So some people who live out in the Hamptons would know about the horseshoe crab. They have a whole kind of mating thing where they come out of the water, and there's just wonderful things. Well, how did I end up with this horseshoe crab to get to that? I taught at Dowling College for a while, and they had a marine biology department. And that's when I learned about the horseshoe crab. And we did, for the art club, we did a beautiful mural about the horseshoe crab. And I learned all about the horseshoe crab from not knowing anything about it to knowing everything about the horseshoe crab, all of its ins and outs of mating and life cycles and history and all of that. So I had always wanted to do something with that. And these are taken, the photos that you see here are solar plates. They're not really photos. They're drawn, but out of blow-ups of the horseshoe crab images. And the reason why they don't really look so much like the horseshoe crab, where you could see over there, the horseshoe crab actually swims upside down, so it kind of looks like a helmet, and it's shaped like a horseshoe, so that's why they would call it the horseshoe crab. These were taken from photos that I actually took of horseshoe crabs that were in their marine biology lab. So you can hold the horseshoe crab and move it around. And anyway, I just thought it was just an amazing creature. And I found that the more I printed it, I could print it in color and on tinted paper, on canvas, and created a whole series of images about the horseshoe crab. So there also is a very big book. And the book is really just mostly the facts about the horseshoe crab, but written in my own words. So a little bit about the mating cycle is kind of interesting because it seems that they all come beach during the strawberry moon. So somehow or another I ended up with this painting called The Strawberry Moon. So you can see the moon there, and then it turned into all sorts of things like the night blooming cirrus and this little tiny nut that I would draw. So I've been into, like, lately, making kind of these large kind of wash surfaces and then drawing things on top of them. So this is just kind of a selection of the newer things, and there'll be more things to come. Right now I'm working on a series about riding on an elephant in India. So exactly how that's going to go, I don't know. So I'm working with different pieces and collage pieces and kind of letting all those things go. So I've always taken my artwork very, very seriously, and it's lovely to jump into other people's heads, but wonderful to come back to mine and be able to develop my work. And you can see I love this wash idea, and Emily is kind of there, but I've always been working with the wash, and that's a wash on board. And then the idea of the book is also kind of part of that idea of the series. So here, just with the calligraphy and the writing, and being able to do something dimensional and shaped that doesn't necessarily fit into a frame. So I've always kind of been working with that idea too. And for a while I was doing things that were two-sided that I would fold, so finding the backs of things can be as interesting as the fronts of things. So just keeping a very open view to what I'm doing. So and letting all those things that I learn with other people come into play with it. And I do think it's just a wonderful way to know artists, is to work with them. So your teaching is a little different than actually being able to create something that's, you know, theirs. So anyway, that's...
Well, Lisa, thank you so much.
Really? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay. Well, I think we should have something to eat now.